Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, the place where we tell stories of fathers, mothers, and the quiet sacrifices that shape the heart of a family. These are stories that might remind you of your own father's hands, your mother's voice, or the moments when love and disappointment lived side by side under one roof. If you find meaning in these stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let these shadows of family life walk with you. Tonight's story is titled, "My Daughter Moved Her New Husband into My House and Told Me to Leave." Richard Lane never thought of himself as extraordinary. He wasn't the kind of man whose name appeared in newspapers or whose face ever shone under bright lights. He was a quiet man, steady as oak, the sort of father who measured his love not in grand speeches but in the small, invisible threads of everyday life. The house he lived in was proof of that. A modest two-story home on the edge of town, with paint fading on the shutters and a porch that creaked in protest whenever the wind pressed against it. To anyone else, it was just another aging house, the kind you drive past without a second glance. But to Richard, it was a vessel of memory. He had laid the first tiles with his own hands. He had planted the maple tree out back on the day Julia, his daughter, was born. He and Clara, his wife, had chosen the curtains together, arguing half an hour in the department store before laughing at how stubborn they both were. Even the crack in the hallway, running like a crooked smile across the plaster, carried meaning. It had appeared during a storm years ago, when thunder rattled the windows and Julia, just 5 years old, had run into his arms, trembling, whispering, "Daddy, the house is scared." Clara had been gone for almost 10 years now. Cancer had taken her in a slow, merciless way, peeling away her laughter, her strength, until only silence filled the room where she once read books in the evening. Richard had remained in that house not because he was unable to move on, but because every room still held her presence. To leave, he thought, would be to abandon her a second time. He lived alone now, though alone is never quite the right word when memories sit beside you at breakfast, when voices echo down the hall long after they've stopped speaking. His daughter Julia had grown, moved out, married young, and tried to build a life of her own. He had watched her leave with pride, the way fathers do when they realize the world has laid claim to the child they once carried on their shoulders. But pride was a complicated thing. Julia's marriage had faltered. Richard never pressed her for details. He believed in giving his daughter the dignity of privacy. Still, when she appeared at his door one spring afternoon, suitcase in hand and eyes swollen from crying, Richard opened the door without question. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking, "I just need a place for a little while." And what father could say no? So Julia returned. At first, it was as if life had rewound itself. Richard found himself cooking for two again, leaving a plate on the table where Clara once sat. He heard laughter in the house once more, the sound of footsteps upstairs. Julia had always filled a room with her presence, a spark inherited from her mother. He told himself it was good, yes, good that the house was alive again. But shadows have a way of lingering behind the laughter. Richard's neighbors, people who had known him for decades, nodded with sympathy when they saw Julia's car in the driveway. Some of them whispered too. Divorce, second chances, a young woman moving back with her father. These were familiar stories in their small town. Richard ignored the whispers. Instead, he spent his evenings in the backyard, tending to the garden Clara had once cherished. The roses were stubborn, refusing to bloom without her touch. Still, Richard tried. He clipped weeds, watered the soil, and when he was finished, he sat in the old chair beneath the maple tree. It was there, as the sun dipped low, that he would sometimes speak aloud to Clara, telling her how Julia was doing, telling her that their little girl was home again, even if it was only for a while. Time, however, never stays still. Julia's laughter grew lighter, freer, until one day she mentioned a new name. "Dad, I've been seeing someone," she said one evening, twirling a strand of hair around her finger as they sat at the kitchen table. Richard looked up from his newspaper. The words landed in his chest with the weight of something inevitable. He smiled, though it was a careful, practiced smile. "That's good, sweetheart. What's his name?" "Jason," she replied. "Jason Reed." She said it as though the name itself carried promise. Richard nodded. I'd like to meet him. And he would sooner than he expected. The first time Jason came to the house, Richard studied him with the quiet intensity only fathers possess. Jason was tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy charm of someone who had learned how to win people over with a handshake and a grin. He wore a pressed shirt, his hair styled neatly, and he carried himself with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Mr. Lane," Jason said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Julia has told me so much." Richard shook his hand, the grip firm but not crushing. "Richard," he replied simply. They sat for dinner. Julia was radiant, her laughter filling the room like it hadn't in years. Jason spoke often, telling stories of his work, his plans, his philosophy on life. He complimented the house, the neighborhood, even the meal Richard had cooked. And yet, beneath the charm, Richard sensed something else, a subtle undercurrent, like a note in music that doesn't quite belong but hums persistently in the background. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and Julia had gone upstairs, Richard lingered alone in the kitchen. He touched the back of Clara's chair, as he often did, and whispered, "What do you think of him?" Of course, no answer came, only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the house settling around him. Weeks passed. Jason became a more frequent visitor until his toothbrush appeared in the upstairs bathroom, then a jacket on the coat rack, then shoes by the door. Richard said nothing. He told himself it was not his place to interfere in his daughter's choices. Still, he noticed the changes. The family photos of Clara that had hung in the hallway were shifted into a box and carried to the attic. The old rug, threadbare but beloved, was rolled up and replaced with something modern, something Jason chose. Even the maple tree in the backyard, planted the day Julia was born, was discussed. Jason thought it might be better to cut it down. Its roots, he claimed, could damage the foundation. Each time Richard's lips pressed together, the protest rising in his chest but dying before it reached his tongue. He told himself he could bear it. He told himself love meant patience. But patience, like walls, has cracks. On one particular evening, Julia sat across from him at the table, her eyes soft but her voice steady. "Dad," she began, "Jason and we've been talking. We think it would be best if you found another place to stay. Just for a while. We need our space, you know. A home that's ours." The words cut deeper than any storm, sharper than the crack in the plastered wall. Richard sat still, his fork resting untouched on his plate. For a long moment, the silence was so thick he could hear his own heartbeat. He looked at Julia, the little girl who once clung to his hand during thunderstorms, the teenager who asked him to check her car before she drove at night, the woman now sitting before him with a husband and a new life. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he nodded just once and returned to his meal. In the quiet that followed, Julia shifted uncomfortably, as though realizing the weight of what she had asked. Jason, however, looked satisfied, leaning back in his chair as though the decision had already been settled. Richard said nothing, but inside, the ground beneath him shifted. That night, he walked through the house slowly, touching the corners, the shelves, the doorknobs, each one a relic of years that now felt borrowed. In Clara's old room, he stood by the dresser where her jewelry box still rested, unopened since the day she passed. He whispered her name once softly, as if she might answer from the shadows. Then quietly he began to pack. Richard did not sleep that night. He moved slowly from room to room, as though the house itself were a body, and he was saying farewell to each limb, each vein. The photographs of Julia as a child, the ones that had once hung proudly in the living room, now leaned against the wall in boxes. Her high school diploma, once framed above the mantel, lay tucked away in the attic, nearly forgotten. Jason had called them clutter. Julia had not defended them. Richard sat at the kitchen table until the hours turned to dawn. The chair across from him remained empty, the one that had always been Clara's. Sometimes he would imagine her sitting there, her hair pulled back, her hands curled around a mug of tea. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't let them take what's yours, Richard. Don't let them push you out." But Richard had never been a man of confrontation. He was raised to believe that silence was dignity, that sacrifice was love. And so, with the quiet resolve of someone who has weathered too many storms, he began to fold shirts, stack books, and pack his life into cardboard boxes. Julia watched him from the hallway, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. She looked smaller in that moment, as though she had shrunk under the weight of what she had asked of him. "Dad," she said softly, "it's not forever, just until Jason and I, until we settle." Richard nodded. He didn't trust his voice to respond. Words had a way of betraying the heart. When he carried the first box to his truck, the morning sun was only beginning to stretch across the sky. The neighborhood was waking, garbage trucks groaning down the street, dogs barking at invisible threats, sprinklers hissing against manicured lawns. Richard paused for a moment on the porch, his eyes lingering on the house. He remembered the day he and Clara had first walked through its empty halls, their voices echoing off bare walls as they dreamed about the family they would build there. He remembered carrying Julia, only 6 years old at the time, across the threshold when the papers were finally signed. She had squealed with joy, shouting, "It's our castle, Daddy!" And now, decades later, he was the one leaving the castle, by request of the very child who once called it home. He loaded the truck without complaint. A suitcase, 2 boxes of books, a smaller box filled with Clara's keepsakes, her wedding ring, her letters, the scarf she had worn every winter until the year she could no longer fight the cold. He left the larger furniture behind. He told himself it was only wood, only fabric. The soul of the house was already leaving with him. Jason emerged from the doorway as Richard was fastening the last strap on the truck bed. His arms were crossed, his posture relaxed, as though watching a task finally being completed. "Appreciate you understanding, Richard," Jason said. His tone was polite, but it carried the unmistakable finality of someone claiming ownership. "This'll give us all some breathing room, you know." Richard only nodded. He could feel Julia's eyes on him from inside the house, but he did not turn back. When he climbed into the driver's seat, his hands lingered on the steering wheel. It had been years since he'd driven anywhere without the certainty of returning here. He took one last look at the house. The shutters, chipped and fading. The porch swing he had hung for Julia when she was 7. The window of the room where Clara once sat with her knitting. He started the engine. The truck rumbled down the street, carrying him away from the home that had once been his anchor. Richard did not move far. He found a small apartment above a hardware store on the edge of town. It smelled faintly of dust and motor oil, and the pipes groaned at night as though they too were reluctant to let go of what once was. He furnished it with the bare minimum: a bed, a chair, a table. The boxes remained stacked against the wall, unopened. He lived quietly, slipping into a life of shadows. He ate simple meals, read the same books he had read a dozen times, and walked each evening past the park where he and Clara once brought Julia to feed ducks. Sometimes, neighbors from the old street would see him and ask how he was. Richard would smile politely and say, "I'm fine." Because what else could he say? That he had been asked to leave the house he built, that his daughter had chosen space over his presence. These were not the kinds of truths one spoke aloud. Meanwhile, life continued in the house he had left behind. Julia and Jason hosted dinners with friends, laughter spilling out of the windows late into the night. Jason replaced the curtains, repainted the walls, and brought in new furniture. He spoke of the house as though it were his achievement, his domain. Julia went along, though sometimes, late at night, she would find herself wandering into the attic, where boxes of her childhood still rested. She would open one and pull out an old photo, her father lifting her onto his shoulders at the county fair, her mother's arms wrapped around them both. For a fleeting moment, guilt would tighten her chest, but then Jason would call her back downstairs, and the guilt would dissolve into the rhythm of her new life. Richard noticed the changes from a distance. He drove by the house once or twice, his truck slowing as he passed. He saw new lights in the windows, a new car in the driveway. Once he saw Julia laughing on the porch, Jason's arm draped casually over her shoulders. For a moment, Richard's heart lifted. Her happiness was all he had ever wanted. But then his eyes shifted to the maple tree in the backyard, and he noticed the red spray-painted mark at its base. Jason intended to cut it down. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That tree had been planted the day Julia was born, its roots deep in the soil of their family's history. Clara had watered it with devotion. Richard had measured Julia's height against it every year, carving lines into its trunk as she grew. To see it marked for removal was like watching someone erase time itself. He drove on, unable to bear the sight. Weeks passed. Life in the apartment grew smaller, quieter. Richard found himself writing letters he never sent, to Julia, to Clara, even to himself. Words poured out in ink where they could not find voice in his throat. Julia, one letter read, "I don't begrudge you your happiness, but sometimes happiness comes at a cost we do not see until it is too late. One day I hope you understand what you asked of me." He folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer where it joined the others. It was on an ordinary Tuesday while he sat at the small kitchen table sorting through his mail that the first envelope arrived. Thick, official, stamped with the seal of the county clerk. Richard opened it carefully, scanning the printed words. Property taxes, mortgage statements, legal notices, all addressed to him. For a long time he simply stared at the papers, the truth pressing against him like a tide. Of course, the house was still his. Every nail, every window, every beam still belonged to Richard Lane. Jason might live there, Julia might laugh there, but the law, the ink on the deed, told a different story. And for the first time in many months, Richard felt something stir inside him. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet strength he thought he had lost. Richard laid the stack of envelopes neatly on the table, his fingers resting on them as if they were something fragile, something alive. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, traffic rolled by on the street below, muffled and distant. He read the name again, his own, printed clearly, not Julia's, not Jason's. The house was still his. It shouldn't have surprised him. After Clara died, they had never transferred the deed. Julia was young then, only beginning her life, and Richard had told himself he would hold the home until she was ready. He had always assumed the day would come when she would inherit it, when it would be hers in name as well as in memory. But life had shifted, and now the papers reminded him of what no one else seemed to know. The house still bore his name, his signature, his claim. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. For months, he had swallowed silence, believing it to be the noblest act of love. He had left without protest, choosing exile rather than conflict. But now the silence felt different. It was no longer patience. It was surrender. And Richard Lane was not ready to surrender. 2 days later, he walked into a law office downtown. The receptionist greeted him kindly, directing him to a narrow conference room with walls lined in bookshelves. A young attorney entered, crisp suit, polished shoes, eyes that looked as though they hadn't yet seen the weight of the world. "How can I help you, Mr. Lane?" the attorney asked. Richard placed the deed on the table. His hands were steady, though inside he felt the tremor of something awakening. "I need to know," he said slowly, "exactly what my rights are." The lawyer scanned the papers, nodding. "This property is fully in your name. Taxes are current. There's no lien, no joint ownership. Legally, you're the sole owner. If you wanted, you could sell it tomorrow." Richard said nothing at first. He looked at the paper, at the familiar strokes of his own handwriting from years ago. He thought of Clara's laughter echoing through those walls, of Julia learning to ride a bike in the driveway, of Christmas mornings when wrapping paper littered the floor. Could he really sell it? Could he part with the last living link to those memories? But then he remembered Julia's voice that night, quiet but firm. "Dad, can you move out?" He remembered Jason's satisfied smirk as he tightened his arm around her shoulders. Richard exhaled, his breath long and heavy. "Draw up the paperwork," he said. The attorney looked at him. "You're sure?" Richard nodded. "I'm sure." Meanwhile, inside the house on Maple Drive, Julia and Jason were living as though they had claimed a kingdom. Jason had repainted the living room, knocked down a wall in the kitchen, and installed a brand new television that stretched nearly the width of the wall. He called the house our project, a place they would shape into their future. Julia went along, though sometimes, when Jason wasn't looking, she wandered the halls and felt the ghosts of her childhood pressing in. She saw the faint outline of where her growth marks had been etched into the door frame. She saw the scuff marks on the stairs where her bicycle helmet had tumbled down one rainy afternoon. She remembered her father's laugh, rare but deep, filling the house when Clara teased him about his cooking. Jason didn't notice those things. He noticed only what could be replaced, renovated, improved. One evening, while Julia prepared dinner, Jason came in holding a stack of envelopes. "Bills came," he said casually, dropping them on the counter. He frowned as he flipped through them. "Funny," he muttered. "They're still addressed to your dad." Julia looked at them, her stomach twisting. "Maybe it just hasn't updated yet," she offered weakly. Jason smirked. "Or maybe your dad never really let go of this place. Guess we'll have to fix that sooner or later." Julia didn't answer. She only stirred the pot on the stove, her hands trembling slightly. Back in his apartment, Richard sat by the window watching the evening settle over the town. Lights flickered on in neighboring buildings, shadows stretched long across the pavement. He thought of Julia, of the child she had been and the woman she was becoming under Jason's influence. He thought of the night he left the house, of how heavy his heart had felt. But now, with the deed in his drawer and the attorney's words echoing in his ears, he felt something shift. He was not powerless. He had not been erased. The decision weighed on him, but it was his to make. For once, he would not let silence decide for him. It was a Friday morning when Julia opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope stamped from the law office downtown. She carried it inside, her hands cold despite the warmth of the day. Jason was in the living room, sprawled across the couch, watching television. "What's that?" he asked. Julia didn't answer immediately. She tore open the seal and unfolded the papers. The words blurred for a moment, but one line cut through clear as glass. "Notice of intent to sell property." Her breath caught. "Jason," she whispered, "it's Dad. He's selling the house." Jason sat up, his face hardening. "What do you mean he's selling it? This is our house." Julia's voice broke. "No, it isn't. It was never ours. It's still his. It's always been his." Jason snatched the papers from her hand, scanning them with growing fury. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the edges of the page. Richard Lane's name stared back at him, bold and unyielding. For the first time since he had moved into that house, Jason Reed realized the truth. He was not the master of this domain. He was a guest, and the guest was about to be shown the door. Julia sat at the kitchen table, the legal papers spread before her like a wound she couldn't close. Jason paced the length of the room, his fists clenched, his voice rising with each turn. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Your dad can't just waltz back in and take this house out from under us. We've put money into it. We've made improvements. We've built a life here." Julia stared down at the notice, her fingers tracing the sharp black letters of her father's name. Richard Lane. For all the changes, for all the renovations and repainted walls, his name had never left. It was carved into the foundation, written into the law, bound to the very wood of the home. She swallowed. "Jason, it's his house. It's always been his." Jason stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Are you taking his side now?" Julia's lips trembled. She remembered the night her father packed his things, the way he carried Clara's photographs as though they were made of glass. She remembered how he didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't beg to stay. He just left, silent, heartbroken, and she had let him. "I'm not taking sides," she whispered. "I'm just saying it's his right." Jason slammed his palm against the counter. No, it's not right. Not after everything we've put into this place. He's doing this to punish us." But Julia shook her head. Deep down, she knew her father was not a man of punishment. He was a man of quiet endurance, of patience stretched thin until it broke. And now perhaps it had finally broken. The following Sunday, a knock sounded at the front door. Julia froze at the sound, her breath catching in her throat. Jason muttered something under his breath and stormed toward the door, yanking it open. There, standing on the porch, was Richard Lane. He looked older than Julia remembered, though only a few months had passed since she last saw him. His shoulders were still broad, his frame still strong, but his eyes carried a new weight, firm, unshakable, as if he had come not as a visitor but as a man reclaiming something that was his. "Richard," Jason said flatly, being the doorframe as though to bar his entry. Richard's gaze shifted past him, landing on Julia. For a moment the world shrank to the space between them, the father who had given everything and the daughter who had asked him to leave. "Julia," he said softly, her throat tightened. "Dad," Jason stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "You can't just show up here making threats. This is our home now." Richard's voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of stone. "No, son, it's mine, and you've known that from the start." Jason scoffed, though his grip on the doorframe betrayed his unease. "You walked away, that was your choice." Richard's eyes didn't waver. "You asked me to. My daughter asked me to, and I left because sometimes silence is the only gift a father can give. But silence doesn't erase truth. And the truth is, this house was built by my hands, signed under my name, and filled with the memories of a family you will never understand." The words cut through the air. Julia felt them pierce her chest like arrows. Jason laughed bitterly. "So what now? You sell it out from under us. Leave your own daughter on the street." Richard turned to Julia then, his voice softened, but the resolve in it remained. "I never wanted to take anything from you, Julia, but when love is twisted into something that pushes a man from his own home and when kindness is mistaken for weakness, then a line has to be drawn." Tears blurred Julia's eyes. "Dad, I didn't mean," her voice faltered. She had meant every word that night, hadn't she? She had asked him to leave. She had chosen comfort over compassion, silence over confrontation. Richard stepped closer to the threshold. "Julia, this house was never meant to be a prison for me. It was meant to be a shelter for you, and now you've let someone else turn it into a place where I no longer belong. So yes, I'll sell it. Because sometimes the only way to remind people of what they've lost is to take it away." Jason's jaw tightened, his anger sharp and hot. But Julia's face crumpled, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her mouth. She saw in her father not cruelty but sorrow, not revenge but a lesson written in the only language he had left to speak. The porch was silent, save for the creak of the floorboards beneath Richard's weight. For the first time in months, Julia saw him not as a man defeated but as a man standing tall in his truth. And in that silence, she realized what Jason never could. Her father had not come to destroy her world. He had come to show her what it meant to value it. The papers did not wait. Within a week, an official notice appeared on the mailbox, the kind of envelope that carried weight no one could ignore. It was stapled thick, stamped with the county seal, and written in the same language that had once told Richard his wife's illness was terminal. The same cold, certain language that had shaped the years since. Jason tore it open first, his face flushing red as he scanned the words. "He's serious," he muttered, his voice shaking with outrage. "He's actually doing this." Julia reached for the pages, her fingers trembling. She read the lines slowly as though each sentence carved deeper into her chest. Notice of listing. Intent to sell. Her father's name printed bold at the top, the property description written in precise detail below. Every inch of the house she had grown up in was reduced to a paragraph, a transaction waiting to happen. Jason slammed the papers onto the table. "We can fight this. I'll get a lawyer. He can't just throw us out like this." But Julia knew better. She had seen the look in her father's eyes when he stood on the porch. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't threatening. He was telling the truth. And the truth was heavier than any argument Jason could make. She sank into a chair, her palms pressed against her eyes. Memories rose unbidden. The Christmas mornings by the fireplace, the nights Clara tucked her in, the mornings Richard drove her to school. A steaming cup of coffee balanced on the dash. It wasn't just a house. It was her childhood, her mother's love, her father's devotion. And she had let another man replace all of that with paint and furniture. The days that followed were thick with tension. Julia drifted through the house like a ghost, touching the walls, opening drawers, lifting objects that had belonged to her mother. Jason watched her with growing impatience. "You can't let him do this to us," he said one night as they lay in bed. His voice was sharp, cutting into the dark. "If you give in now, we'll lose everything, don't you see that?" Julia turned onto her side, her eyes fixed on the faint outline of the window. The maple tree stood tall outside, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. She thought of her father's hands planting it, of Clara's laughter as they spread soil over the roots. "Maybe," Julia whispered. "It was never ours to lose." Jason sat up, his frustration spilling over. "So what, you're just going to roll over and let him take it? Where are we supposed to go?" Julia's voice broke. "Jason, it's his house. It's always been his." For a long time, the only sound was Jason's breathing, heavy and angry. Julia lay still, her body trembling, her mind torn between the man she had married and the father she had abandoned. Meanwhile, in his apartment above the hardware store, Richard sat at his small desk, the contract spread out before him. The realtor had explained everything carefully, listing price, market trends, buyer interest. It was just business to them, another property to pass from one hand to another. But to Richard it was more than business. It was a reckoning. He thought often of Clara. What would she say if she could see him now, pen in hand, ready to part with the walls they had built together? Would she tell him to hold on, to forgive? Or would she remind him that love without respect is not love at all, but something weaker, something dangerous? The pen felt heavy in his hand. He signed anyway. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. The Lane's house, the old Lane place as people called it, was on the market. Neighbors whispered over fences, shaking their heads. Some said it was about time, others wondered what had gone wrong. A few looked at Julia with pity when they saw her in the yard, her eyes red, her steps unsteady. She avoided their gazes. One afternoon, as she carried groceries inside, Mrs. Adler from next door called out gently, "Julia, honey, I heard about the house. I'm so sorry." Julia forced a smile, but the words lodged in her throat. Sorry for what? For losing her home or for losing her father's trust? She couldn't tell anymore. Inside, Jason grew more restless by the day. He ranted about betrayal, about injustice, about how Richard was ungrateful after everything he and Julia had invested. But Julia stopped listening. His words clanged in her ears like empty bells. Instead, she found herself standing longer in the attic, opening the boxes she had once ignored. She pulled out Clara's scarf, still faintly scented of lavender. She held the family photo albums, page after page of Richard's quiet presence, behind the camera, holding her steady on a bicycle, sitting in the bleachers at her school play, always there, always watching. The guilt pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. A week later, another knock came at the door. Julia's heart jumped, knowing even before she opened it who would be standing there. Richard. He looked tired but resolved, the same steadiness in his eyes as before. He held no anger in his face, only a quiet sadness. "Julia," he said softly, "we need to talk." Jason appeared behind her, his shoulders squared. "We have nothing to say to you." But Julia lifted her hand, silencing him. Her eyes filled with tears as she met her father's gaze. "Come in, Dad." For the first time in months, Richard Lane stepped back into his house. The air inside the house felt different the moment Richard crossed the threshold. It was his house. He could feel it in his bones, but it no longer carried his rhythm. The furniture had been rearranged, the colors on the walls were new, and the faint scent of Clara's lavender perfume that once lingered in the halls had been replaced by something sharper, foreign. Richard paused in the entryway, his eyes moving slowly over the space. His hand brushed against the doorframe, and for an instant Julia thought he might falter, but he didn't. He stood tall, quiet, and unyielding. Jason lingered behind Julia, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with hostility. But Julia couldn't tear her gaze from her father. For months she had avoided him, avoided the truth of what she had done. And now here he was, flesh and blood, standing in the home she had asked him to leave. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard's eyes softened as they met hers. "Julia." The sound of her name in his voice nearly undid her. She remembered being little, the way he called her in for dinner from the yard, the way his voice cut through the dark when she had nightmares. That voice had always meant safety. Now it only reminded her of how far she had drifted. Jason broke the silence first. "This is pointless," he snapped. "You've made your decision, Richard. You're selling the house. Fine, but don't come in here acting like you've got the moral high ground. You walked out, you left." Richard turned to him, calm but firm. "No, I didn't walk out. I was asked to leave by you, by her." His gaze shifted back to Julia and his voice softened again. "And because she asked, I did it. That's what a father does." Julia's throat tightened. Tears burned her eyes as guilt rushed over her like a tide. "Dad, I didn't." "Yes, you did." Richard's voice was gentle but steady. "You asked me to go, and I went, not because I wanted to, not because I was tired of this place, but because you are my daughter. And if my leaving gave you peace, even at the cost of my own heart, then I would do it." Jason scoffed. "Oh, please spare us the guilt trip." Richard's eyes flicked to him, sharp now. "You don't understand, Jason. You've never understood. A house isn't just walls and paint. It's the weight of years, the echo of laughter, the memory of someone you loved more than yourself. I built this house with my hands. I raised Julia here with Clara. Every board, every nail has a story you'll never know." Jason bristled, but Julia laid a hand on his arm, silencing him. Her tears spilled freely now. She stepped toward her father, her voice breaking. "Dad, I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd be happier away from here, that maybe it would be easier for you to let go of Mom." Her breath caught. "But I see it now. I see how wrong I was." Richard reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Julia, you don't need to be sorry for trying to build a life. That's what I always wanted for you. But don't mistake love for weakness. Don't mistake silence for consent. A father will bend until he breaks if it means his child can stand tall. But even a father has limits." Julia's body shook with sobs, and she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his chest like she had when she was a child. His arms wrapped around her instinctively, steady, warm, unshakable. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his anger deflating into something more brittle: frustration, fear. He had no place in this embrace, no claim to the history that bound them. Richard held Julia tightly. "This house was never meant to divide us," he murmured. "But sometimes, when we lose sight of what matters, the walls themselves have to teach us the lesson we refuse to learn." Julia pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears. "What's going to happen, Dad? What will we do when it's gone?" Richard's eyes were steady. "When it's gone, you'll remember what home really means. It isn't these walls, it isn't this roof. It's the love we give, the respect we show, the way we hold each other even when the world tries to pull us apart. That's what your mother taught me. That's what I want to leave you with." For a long moment, silence filled the house. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of truth, heavy but cleansing. And for the first time since she had asked him to leave, Julia felt like her father was home again, even if only for a little while. The house went quiet after Richard left that evening, though his presence lingered in every corner. Julia wandered through the rooms long after Jason had stormed upstairs, her hand brushing over the surfaces he had once built. The banister along the staircase, smoothed by years of her small hands gripping it as she ran down to breakfast. The fireplace mantel, where every Christmas morning a new row of stockings had been hung. Even the floorboard seemed to whisper his footsteps. But now those whispers would soon belong to strangers. 2 days later, the first for sale sign appeared on the lawn. Bright red and white, staked firmly into the ground, it leaned toward the street like a proclamation. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, whispering. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded as though they had expected it all along. Jason ripped the sign from the ground within the hour, dragging it into the garage with a curse. But by morning, a new one stood in its place, planted deeper, steadier. Julia stood at the window, staring at it, her heart pounding with a strange rhythm: grief, guilt, inevitability. She turned away when Jason stormed past her. "He can't do this," Jason fumed. "He can't just erase us like we're nothing." Julia whispered, almost to herself. "Maybe he's not erasing us. Maybe he's reminding us of what we lost." Jason whirled on her. "Don't you dare defend him." But Julia didn't argue, she couldn't. The ache in her chest told her that defending her father was the only thing she had left. The realtor came on a Thursday morning. A woman in a navy blazer, polite but efficient, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. She spoke in numbers, in square footage, in comparable properties. Jason followed her like a shadow, his voice dripping with forced charm. "Beautiful house, right? We've done a lot of work on it. Open concept, new paint, all modern touches." But the realtor's eyes fell on Julia standing quietly in the corner. "Your father kept this place well. Solid bones, good foundation." Julia's chest tightened. She remembered the weekends Richard had spent repairing shingles, tightening pipes, sanding down the porch swing. Quiet work, unnoticed, done with care. Her father had always been like that, the kind of man who fixed what was broken without ever drawing attention to his own hands. As the realtor measured rooms and scribbled notes, Julia drifted into the attic. Dust filled the air, catching light from the single window. Boxes stacked neatly against the wall, each labeled in Richard's careful handwriting: Julia's school years, Clara's belongings, Christmas decorations. She knelt beside one, pried it open, and lifted a photo album from the top. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. Inside, photographs spilled across the pages, Richard holding her as a baby, Clara's smile warm and bright, their small family framed in the glow of years now gone. Her tears fell onto the page before she even realized she was crying. Downstairs, Jason's voice grew sharper as he spoke with the realtor. "Look, I don't care what the paperwork says. This is our home. Julia and I live here. We've invested in it. He has no right to take that from us." The realtor, professional but firm, replied, "Mr. Reed, the deed is clear. This house belongs to Richard Lane. If he wishes to sell, that is his legal right." Jason's fist slammed against the counter. "It's not fair." Julia flinched at the sound, hugging the album to her chest as though it might shield her. She wanted to shout that fairness wasn't the point, that love and respect had been the only currency that mattered in this house. But the words caught in her throat, heavy and choking. By the weekend, the first potential buyers arrived. A young couple with a toddler, their eyes bright as they stepped through the door. They marveled at the hardwood floors, at the size of the backyard, at the tree standing tall behind the house. "That tree's perfect for a tire swing," the father said, smiling at his son. Julia's heart clenched. She remembered her own childhood, Richard tying a rope swing to that same tree, pushing her higher and higher while Clara laughed from the porch. Jason forced a smile, his voice honeyed. Yes, the backyard is great, plenty of room for kids. We've really made this place our own." But Julia saw the lie in his words. It wasn't his own, it had never been. The couple left, murmuring about offers, about schools, about dreams of their own. Julia stood in the doorway long after they drove away, staring at the street, her chest hollow. That night the house was unbearably silent. Jason sat with a drink in his hand, bitterness etched into his face. "We're not letting this happen," he said. "I don't care what it takes. We'll fight him. We'll stall the sale. We'll—" "Jason." Julia's voice cut through, steady though her hands trembled. He turned to her, startled by the firmness in her tone. "This isn't about you. It never was. This house isn't yours to fight for. It isn't even mine. It's his. It always was." Jason stared at her, incredulous. "You're siding with him after everything." Tears welled in Julia's eyes, but she held his gaze. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm finally telling the truth." The silence between them was heavier than words. Upstairs, in the attic, the album still lay open on the floor, pages filled with a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. And for the first time, Julia wondered if losing the house was the only way to finally see him clearly. By the following week, the Lane house was no longer just a home. It was a listing. It appeared on websites, in glossy photographs, and in small boxes on the back pages of the local paper. Words like spacious, well-maintained, and family-friendly neighborhood described the rooms where Julia had once learned to walk, where Clara had once sung lullabies, where Richard had once knelt in prayer after hearing the word cancer. The transformation was brutal in its simplicity, a lifetime turned into a commodity. On Saturday morning, 2 more families arrived for viewings. Julia trailed behind the realtor as they moved through the house, her stomach twisting with every admiring comment. "The light here is wonderful. What a solid foundation. I could see our kids growing up in this room." Each sentence struck her like a hammer. These were the same words her parents had once spoken when they first toured the empty house, dreaming of the life they would build. Jason tried to insert himself at every turn, boasting about improvements he had made, about plans he had for the yard, about how they had shaped the house into what it was today. The realtor smiled politely, but her words were firm when buyers asked about ownership. "The property belongs to Mr. Richard Lane. He is the seller." Julia winced every time her father's name was spoken aloud. It felt like a bell tolling, reminding her of the truth she could no longer ignore. That evening, Jason's temper boiled over. He slammed the fridge door, his drink spilling across the counter. "He's doing this on purpose," Jason snapped. "He doesn't want to sell the house, he wants to humiliate us. He wants to prove he still holds the power." Julia stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. "Jason, maybe he's not trying to prove anything. Maybe he's just finally standing up for himself." Jason turned, eyes blazing. "And you're fine with that? You're fine letting him throw us out on the street?" Her voice shook, but her words were steady. "This was never ours to begin with." The anger in Jason's face faltered, replaced by something sharper: fear. He had gambled everything on this house, on the illusion of ownership. Without it, he was exposed. "You can't actually believe he'll go through with this," Jason said, his tone half pleading now. "He's your father. He wouldn't." But Julia knew better. She had seen the steadiness in her father's eyes, the quiet strength of a man who had endured too much to bend any further. "He will," she whispered. A few days later, Richard returned, not unannounced but with the realtor by his side. They walked the property together, speaking in low, measured tones, pointing out details, discussing next steps. Julia watched from the window, her heart thudding painfully. Jason stormed out onto the porch. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. Richard looked at him evenly, preparing the house. "You can't just walk in here like you own the place," Jason shouted. Richard's voice was calm, resolute. "Jason, I don't walk in like I own the place. I do own it." Jason's fists clenched, but before he could say more, Julia appeared at the doorway. Her eyes met her father's and something inside her broke. "Dad," her voice cracked. She stepped outside, her hands trembling. "Do you really have to sell it? Is there no other way?" Richard's gaze softened as it rested on her. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then quietly he said, "Julia, some lessons can't be taught with words. They have to be lived. This house, it stopped being a home the moment kindness was mistaken for weakness. I can't let that stand." Her tears spilled freely. "But what about me? Where will I go?" Richard's expression wavered with pain, but his voice held steady. "A daughter always has a place with her father, always. But you chose another man's comfort over your father's presence. And choices, they have consequences." Julia's sobs shook her whole body. Jason reached for her arm, but she pulled away, her eyes locked on Richard's. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. Richard placed a hand gently on her cheek. "Then don't. A house is just wood and stone, but respect, that's what keeps love alive. Without it, even the strongest walls will crumble." He turned then, walking back toward his truck, the realtor following behind. The sound of the engine starting echoed down the street, leaving Julia standing on the porch, her heart caught between 2 men, 2 choices, and the truth she could no longer deny. The sign in the yard no longer looked temporary. Its bright colors had faded slightly from the sun, and the stake was driven so deep into the ground that even Jason hadn't tried to rip it up again. For everyone on the street, the meaning was clear. The Lane house was leaving the Lane family. Julia stood at the upstairs window, watching a car slow as it passed. A couple leaned forward in the front seat, pointing toward the house. She could almost hear their words, "That one's for sale, perfect for us." Her stomach knotted. She pressed her forehead against the glass, closing her eyes. Behind her, Jason muttered darkly as he scrolled through his phone. "I'm not letting this happen. I don't care what it takes. I'll find a way to stop it. Lawyers, loopholes, anything." Julia turned. "Jason, you can't fight what isn't yours." The words hung heavy in the room. For a moment, Jason just stared at her, stunned by the bluntness of her tone. Then his face hardened. "So that's it. You're going to let him throw us out. You're siding with him now." Tears pricked Julia's eyes, but she stood her ground. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm finally seeing the truth. This was his house before it was ours. It was his love, his work, his life, and we treated it like it was disposable." Jason's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You sound just like him. Do you even realize what you're saying? Without this place, we have nothing." "Nothing." Julia flinched at the desperation in his voice. It wasn't love for the house that consumed him. It was fear of losing the security it offered. For Jason, the house was leverage. For Julia, it was memory. For Richard, it was a lesson carved deep into the walls. A week later, Richard met with the realtor again, this time walking the backyard with a young family who wanted to see the property. Julia watched from the porch, her heart caught in her throat. The father pointed toward the maple tree. "That's a beauty, old, strong. My son would love climbing it." Richard's eyes lingered on the tree. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face, pride, sorrow, memory. He nodded. "It stood a long time, seen a lot." Julia's chest tightened. She wanted to run down, to beg them not to take it, not to erase the swing that once carried her through summer evenings. But she stayed frozen in place, her voice locked behind guilt. When the family left, Richard turned and saw her watching. Their eyes met across the yard. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you. I still see you." Then he walked back to his truck. Julia collapsed onto the porch swing, her tears hot and relentless. That night the house felt unbearable. Jason argued, pacing the living room, shouting about rights and fairness and betrayal. Julia sat on the couch, silent, staring at the photographs she had retrieved from the attic. Her younger self grinned up at her from the glossy paper, sandwiched between her mother's warmth and her father's steady arms. She thought of the man upstairs now, the one who raged against loss, who loved walls more than people, and she wondered how she had ever mistaken that for strength. When Jason stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the silence that followed was almost a relief. Days later, another notice arrived. This one more direct, more final. Offer accepted. Closing date pending. Julia unfolded the paper slowly, her breath shallow. The words blurred through her tears. It was real now. The house would no longer be theirs. She walked through the rooms like someone drifting through a museum of her own life. Her fingers trailed along the doorframe where Richard had carved her height year after year. She paused at the kitchen where Clara once taught her to bake bread. She stood in her old bedroom, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung faintly after all these years. Everywhere she looked, she saw her father, his sacrifices, his silence, his love. And for the first time, she understood this wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was a father's last lesson, written not in words but in the language of loss. When Jason returned that evening, Julia was waiting for him. She sat at the kitchen table, the acceptance letter folded neatly in front of her. "It's done," she said quietly. "The house is sold." Jason's face twisted. No, it's not over. I won't let it be over." But Julia shook her head, her voice steady even as tears streaked her face. "It was never ours to begin with, and maybe that's what I needed to remember." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Outside, the maple tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches whispering the truth Julia could no longer deny. Her father had never truly left. The day Richard returned to the house, the sky was heavy with clouds. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air carried the smell of it, thick and restless, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Julia sat on the porch steps, her shoulders hunched, the acceptance letter still folded in her hand. She had read it so many times the creases had begun to tear. Each word felt like a verdict, not just on the house but on her choices. When she saw her father's truck pull up to the curb, her breath caught. Jason, inside the house, muttered a curse under his breath and stormed to the door. Richard stepped out of the truck slowly, his posture steady, his expression calm but resolute. He wore his old work jacket, the same one Julia remembered from her childhood winters, the scent of sawdust and coffee clinging to it. For a moment, she was 10 again, running to him after school, burying her face in that jacket because it always meant safety. Now it meant reckoning. Jason threw open the screen door. "You've got some nerve showing up here again." Richard's eyes flicked to him, then settled on Julia. "I came for my daughter." The words silenced everything. The wind seemed to pause. Julia's tears threatened to spill as her father's voice cut clean through the years of distance, through the weight of mistakes. Jason barked a laugh, brittle and sharp. "Your daughter, she's my wife, and this is our life you're trying to destroy." Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Jason, lives aren't built on what you take. They're built on what you give, and all I've seen from you is taking." Jason stepped forward, fists clenched. "You think you're some saint? You abandoned this house. You walked out without a fight. You left it to us." "No," Richard interrupted, his tone suddenly steel. "I didn't abandon it. I was pushed out. By you. By her, and I stayed silent because that's what fathers do when they love too much to fight. But silence doesn't erase truth. And the truth is, this house has my name. It always has." Julia's sob broke through the tension. She stood, clutching the letter, her body trembling. "Stop it, both of you, please." Her father's gaze softened instantly, but Jason's eyes burned with fury. "Julia," Richard said gently, his voice cutting through her tears, "I don't care about the house anymore. I care about you. About whether you remember who stood by you when you were nothing but a child with scraped knees and broken dreams. About whether you understand that love doesn't ask a father to leave his own home so his daughter can feel comfortable with another man." Jason turned to her, desperate now. "Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you. He's bitter and jealous and wants to ruin what we've built." But Julia was no longer looking at Jason. Her eyes were fixed on her father, her chest heaving with grief and longing. She saw not a manipulator, not a bitter man, but the same father who had planted the maple tree on the day she was born, who had carried her to bed when she fell asleep in the car, who had cooked clumsy dinners after Clara died because he couldn't bear to let her eat alone. "Dad," her voice cracked, "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting my new life." Richard stepped closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not touching. "And I never wanted to hurt you. But sometimes, Julia, love means saying no. Love means teaching a lesson even when it breaks your own heart. If I let this go, if I let you believe that kindness is weakness, then I will have failed you as a father." Julia's tears fell freely now. She turned to Jason, her heart in her throat. "Do you hear him? Do you understand what he's saying? This house was never ours to claim, and I let you convince me it was." Jason's face hardened, his desperation spilling into anger. "So what, you're choosing him over me?" Julia's answer came in silence. Her tears, her trembling hands, the way she moved closer to her father, all of it spoke louder than words. Jason's fists shook at his sides. He looked at Richard, then at Julia, then at the house around them. For the first time, his confidence cracked. The walls he thought he owned no longer seemed to stand behind him. Richard finally laid his hand on Julia's shoulder, firm but gentle. "It's not too late, Julia. Houses can be rebuilt. Mistakes can be mended. But you can't keep building a life on ground that was never yours." The storm clouds above finally broke, a low rumble of thunder rolling through the sky. And on that porch, with the rain threatening to fall, Julia Lane realized that the real home she was losing was not the house at all. It was her father, if she didn't choose differently now. The notice came on a Monday morning, folded neatly into the mailbox, closing date 2 weeks. Julia held it in her hands as though it were a summons to her own trial. The words blurred through the veil of her tears. Every line spoke of finality, signatures, inspections, transfer of title. Soon, the house she had been born into would no longer belong to her father, or to her, or even to the memory of her mother. It would pass into the hands of strangers, and with it, the last thread of what bound them together. Jason snatched the paper from her grip, scanning it furiously. His face flushed, his jaw tight. "This isn't happening. I won't let it. He thinks he can push me out, but I'll show him. I'll fight this until the day I die." Julia's voice was weak but sharp enough to cut through his rage. "It was never about you, Jason. He turned, stunned by the steel in her tone. "What did you just say?" Her tears slid down her cheeks, but her eyes did not waver. "This was never about you. It was about him, about my father, about everything he gave without asking anything in return, and about how I let you convince me to turn my back on him." Jason's face twisted. "So now I'm the villain? I'm the one who gave you a life when you had nothing?" "No." Julia's voice broke, but it was steady. "You gave me walls and paint. He gave me a home, and I forgot the difference." The days grew heavier as the closing date approached. Neighbors passed the house with curious eyes, watching the for sale sign as though it were a wound in the neighborhood itself. Some stopped Julia in the yard. "I heard it's final, Mrs. Adler said softly. "I'm sorry, Julia. Your dad was a good man." Julia smiled weakly, her throat aching with words she could not say. "He is a good man, better than I ever gave him credit for." Inside, Jason paced like a trapped animal. He called lawyers, realtors, anyone who would listen, but each conversation ended the same way. "The deed belongs to Richard Lane. The sale is binding." By the end of the week, his rage had curdled into fear. One night, Julia found him in the kitchen, a half-empty bottle on the counter. His hands shook as he poured another drink. "He's taking everything from me," Jason muttered. "Everything. Without this house, what am I? Where do we even go?" Julia's heart clenched. She had once believed his confidence was strength. Now she saw it for what it was, fragility, a fear so deep it needed walls to stand behind. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "Maybe it's not about where we go. Maybe it's about who we are when we get there." Jason looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot, his expression hollow. "And who are you, Julia, his daughter or my wife?" The question sliced through the silence. Julia's breath caught. For months she had tried to live as both, tried to balance love and loyalty, silence and guilt. But now the line was drawn, sharp and merciless. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm his daughter," she whispered. "I always will be." Jason's glass shattered in the sink as he slammed it down. His voice cracked, ragged with desperation. "Then you've made your choice." That night Julia couldn't sleep. She wandered through the darkened rooms, the boards creaking under her feet. She touched the walls, the door frames, the very heart of the house. Memories rose like ghosts, the sound of Clara's laugh, the feel of Richard's strong hands guiding her first steps, the safety of his arms when storms shook the roof. By dawn, her decision was clear. She packed a small bag, filled with the only things she couldn't bear to leave behind. The photo album from the attic, her mother's scarf, a framed picture of her and her father at the county fair. Everything else could stay. Everything else already belonged to the past. When Jason came downstairs, bleary-eyed and bitter, he stopped cold at the sight of her by the door. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Julia lifted the bag to her shoulder. Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "I'm going home." The morning Julia left Jason, the sky was washed clean with light. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the world hushed, as if pausing to watch what would unfold. She walked slowly down the street, the small bag heavy on her shoulder but lighter than the burden she had carried for months. At the end of the block, Richard's truck was parked. He stood beside it, leaning against the door, his jacket zipped against the morning chill. When he saw her coming, his face softened, not in surprise, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. Julia stopped in front of him, breathless. For a moment she could only look at him, the lines of age on his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the patience that had carried her from childhood to this very moment. "Dad," her voice cracked, tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry for everything." Richard reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with the gentlest touch. "There's nothing to be sorry for, Julia. We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is that you've found your way back." She collapsed into his arms then, clinging to him with the desperation of a daughter who had finally remembered where she belonged. Richard held her tightly, his hand cradling the back of her head, his own eyes glistening though he did not let them fall. Behind them, the old Lane house stood silent. Soon it would belong to another family. But in that moment, Julia realized her father was right. Home was not wood or stone. It was this embrace, this love, this truth that could never be sold or taken. 2 weeks later, the sale was finalized. The young family who bought the house moved in with their toddler, their laughter filling the rooms. Richard watched from his truck one last time, a bittersweet smile on his lips. Life was beginning again within those walls, and perhaps that was how it should be. Julia sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Richard shook his head. "No, the house gave us years of love. Now it will give that to someone else. What I keep is here." He pressed a hand against his chest, then placed it gently over hers. And here, tears spilled down Julia's cheeks, but this time they were not only tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of forgiveness, of renewal. As they drove away, the maple tree swayed in the breeze, its branches whispering across the sky, carrying with it the echoes of a family's history and the lesson of a father's love. And so ends today's story. My daughter moved her new husband into my house and told me to leave. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, remember this. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and love is never measured by walls or possessions, but by respect and gratitude. Thank you for listening here on Family Shadows. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. I wish you health, peace, and above all, a happy family to walk beside you in this life. Until next time, take care.